So the inspiration behind the book Wake and the development of the characters was really, it's really hard to tell. They both really happened at the same moment because I'd fallen into one of those brief obsessions that you have. I was reading about unsolved murders and crimes online, and I'd started following these forums for like amateur sleuths, people who try to solve unsolved crimes themselves, looking at all of the publicly available information. And these forums are really fascinating. And, they've done some really incredible things as well. Like, they actually have managed to close some cases, and they often do things like fundraising for DNA tests on Jane Doe's. And, it's at the same time, there's kind of a dark side to this as well, because when you end up in a space like that, it's easy for it to turn into an echo chamber and for people to sort of like lose track of what normal behavior looks like. And so for about 2 weeks, I was reading these forums and just gradually getting more and more uncomfortable with the way that the friends and family of murder victims were being talked about. Because the trouble with an unsolved murder is that the most likely suspects are the people who are closest to the person who died. Like statistically, it's probably going to be one of them. Stranger murders are very unusual. And so it's this dual situation where either they are a grieving innocent person or they are a murderer. And so when amateur sleuths have decided that they're a murderer, then that can sometimes lead to some really questionable behavior. So I was reading one conversation that made me really uncomfortable, where they were talking about the brother of a murder victim. And they were just saying, hey, he's a fairly private person. He doesn't have any social media. I can't find an Instagram. I can't find a Facebook, but he does have a LinkedIn. So I know where he works, and his employer has all of this social media. So I went in there and I found the pictures from their work Christmas party, and this is what they look like. And I was just sitting there and it was like, that is a person. And I was just thinking, if that was me, I would be so angry. And that anger is where the character of Mina McCreary came from. It's like, if that was me and I was that enraged by this situation, Mina is the result. So Mina's situation is that she is the twin sister of a girl who disappeared nearly 20 years ago. And it's become one of those really famous cases that people follow along. And so she has all of these amateur sleuths that are trying to solve her sister's murder. But she has come to a place where she just feels that all of these people digging into her life have never really gotten anywhere, and it just makes it more painful and it's very invasive, and she'd really just rather leave it in the past and get as much privacy as possible. So she's retreated to this very reclusive life that she lives on the family sheep station. She lives there alone now, and she is just trying to get on with life as best as possible and put it all behind her. And so with that character, then I needed somebody who could push her out of that situation. Somebody would come in. If she's an immovable object, she doesn't want this case reopened, who is the unstoppable force that can counter that? And so I started researching about a very particular type of private investigator who doesn't get hired to investigate cases, but looks at cases that have rewards attached. And so they will then go and investigate them independently. And if they manage to reach a solution, then they get the reward. And that's how they, make their living, essentially. And so I thought that was really fascinating. And I wanted to look at that kind of private investigator, someone who is chasing this case specifically after the reward. And then from there, I had to come up with, well, people who do that in real life, they tend to be older, often retired police officers, people who've worked as detectives all of their lives, and this is something they pursue almost as a hobby in retirement. But I wanted Lane Holland to be closer in age to Mina McCreary, so I needed to come up with a reason why someone would have all of the requisite skills and training, but would have decided to pursue this very unstable profession instead of just going into the police and all of the benefits that come with that. What is fun about a private investigator character? It's challenging at the same time. There's certain things that Lane just would, when you use a police officer character, for example, there's certain resources that they can automatically call on. Fingerprints, DNA evidence, they can send other officers out to door knock and collect information. That way, they can get warrants for information and compel people to talk to them. None of that's available to a private investigator. And so often where there is a challenge in a story, that's where it gets really interesting. Like, how do I work around getting the information that Lane needs, working with the resources that he has? And so, yeah, that does sometimes result in working in that gray area. And so you get to do lots of really fun scenes, like where he will, break a lock in order to get into somewhere where he shouldn't be, or, quite often Lane is needing to manipulate other characters in order to get the information that he needs. So being in his point of view means a lot of understanding of why he is speaking to a character in a particular way, what buttons he's trying to push to get a certain emotional reaction from them in order to persuade them to, continue to spend time with him, to continue to have this conversation with him and give him that information that he's looking for. And yeah, sometimes that really does push up against ethical questions about the way that he's treating these people. There is another character in the story who there is a secondary mystery that Mina has a friend who she's met in a support group for people who are the friends and family of missing persons. And so she sends Lane off, essentially trying to deflect him and get rid of him. She sends him off to investigate another character and her family's, mystery. And so it was a balancing act with Lane that he is suddenly working with this other family that he's trying to be compassionate to and empathetic to, but this isn't the case that he wants to be working. And so he needs the information from them, but they're also very conscious that, this is just a means to an end for him. And, he really wants to be on this big case with a big reward attached. And so, I think that he is a fairly emotionally intelligent character, and he can be very kind and empathetic, but at the same time, he really does know how to switch on that manipulation and work people to get what he wants. I definitely saw it as a standalone. Um, I think the great thing about crime fiction, though, is that it's not really a choice between standalone and series, because with any crime fiction book, I think we've all been in that situation where we're off on holiday somewhere or we're browsing a secondhand bookshop and you pick up book number 7 in a series, and you can still pick up that book and it will contain a complete story that's satisfying. And, if you find that you really love that investigator character or love the series, then you can go back and read the other 6 books and not have really lost anything. And so I very much saw Wake as a standalone book. And then when it came time to develop the story for Murder Town, it just kind of crept in that I thought, Lane could play a part in this book. And for a lot of the time that I was developing the story, I was actually worried that it was a little bit self-indulgent, that I wanted to pull him back into the second book. Do I just want to work with a voice that I'm familiar with? But, and it's kind of funny to look back on it now, because I was trying to outline it and, looking at it in terms of, could Lane's subplot be something that could be completely lifted out if I decide that this is not working and it's a bad idea? And by the time the book, had gotten to the point of being a full draft, like, his storyline was so deeply integrated into the story that it's hard to imagine what that book would have looked like without him there. which is good because, I mean, you know, it's been out in Australia for a while, and the consistent feedback I've had is that people were really excited to see Lane come back a second time. So it definitely wasn't just me that wanted to see more from him. Um, but at the same time, the two books are both written as standalone stories that happen to share one character. The serial killer character in the second book, it was called Ripper in Australia, Murder Town in the United States. So the serial killer character he was quite challenging to get inside his head. And there are a couple of tropes in crime fiction that I just really love. You know, it'll just be an instantly pick it up every time for me. And, you know, you mentioned that it sounds a bit funny to be like, you know, I love a copycat, but that's kind of how it works with crime fiction, is that, you know, we love the dark parts. And so I got to play with two things in this book that I do love, which is the copycat killer, and also that the ticking clock of a story that I love is when a serial killer is on death row, which is not something you can do in a book set in Australia. So in my case, it was a serial killer who is in very dire health, and, you know, they don't know how much longer he's going to live. And we need to get the information out of him about either, you know, additional victims he may not have confessed to, or in the case of this book, the identity of a victim that was never named by him. And so that was the goal there, was trying to get that information out of this character. And so writing him was really challenging because that is a very dark point of view to be looking at. And so trying to understand where he's coming from when he has done such awful things, you know, I'm always going to end up empathizing with my characters a lot, but to a certain extent, there are some where it's very challenging to really understand why they chose to do the things that they did. But at the same time, he's got a motivation throughout the book of he has information that he doesn't want to share. And then Lane is trying to get that information out of him as best he can, while also not really letting on that he is being interrogated. It's kind of a cat and mouse game that they're playing, that, you know, they're just like, Lane is essentially undercover. He's been placed into the medical unit with this serial killer character so that he can subtly question him in hopes of getting this information out of him. And so he is both trying to get that information, not reveal that he's trying to get information, and also not putting himself into a situation where he is in danger from this, you know, very unpredictable, violent man. And so the serial killer character, Jan Hunting Klossner, was quite challenging to write because there's all of these different layers that I'm trying to keep track of both, you know, what he actually knows, what he's willing to say, and also his rising annoyance with Lane, or, you know, on the flip side, where their relationship is at. Like, is he currently annoyed by Lane? Is he currently feeling quite close to Lane? You know, that was all just something that I had to keep track of throughout the book and keep balanced. There's a lot of myth making that goes on with serial killers. I think, like, Australia is really preoccupied. We've got our own homegrown ones, and, you know, there is a little bit of that culture of it here. Like, you know, you get a lot of jokes about how the city of Adelaide down in South Australia, they have a disproportionate number of them, and they're almost proud of it, like they're the serial killer capital of Australia. But it's just kind of gallows humor as well. I don't think it's that same kind of glorifying of the actual person who committed it. But I think there's a lot of myth making that goes into, and especially it was really common in the 1970s, of these serial killers. They had these fancy names, and Ted Bundy, for example, like, everybody knows the story of, he's so charismatic, and, you know, women liked him so much, and he was so smart, and he had so much potential. And, you know, I actually read a really good book recently called A Light in the Dark that was actually written by one of his surviving victims. And she comes down really hard on this myth making. She says, look, if you actually talk to people who knew Ted Bundy, like, No, he wasn't smart and people didn't like him and women found him creepy. Like, and he wasn't this amazing charismatic trickster. Like, he broke into my room in the middle of the night and, hit me. Like, there's no, yeah. I think it's a really good book that's worth reading. Like, just a quick plug there. But yeah, so I don't like that sort of I think it's great in fiction. I love Hannibal Lecter. I love every adaptation of the Hannibal Lecter story, but I think it needs to stay in fiction as well. Um, so that was very much on my mind of this sort of myth making, especially around that story of going into a prison to interview a serial killer. I think that we also see a little bit of that glorification happening of, you know, wanting to go in and talk to the serial killers and, what can we learn from them? And this is so important. And it's also really important to keep in mind that they're, you know, very twisted individuals and they're just as likely to try and mess with people who are trying to interview them. Like, you have to be careful with that. And that was something that I wanted to be really aware of in the storytelling, and that Lane is very aware of, that this person could have absolutely figured out what's going on here and could just be messing with him for his own entertainment. And that made for a fun element to weave in as well.